So Anna, I was at an event on Friday night, and a progressive came up and asked me about the Armenian Genocide. And so I want to take this moment to clarify a couple of things, because even when progressives are asking me, I realize that a lot of the stuff online has spread too far and is wildly inaccurate. So I wanted to address a bunch of things. Some things have some kernel of truth, and others are wholly made up. I'm going to get back to the Armenian Genocide in a second, because that actually has a kernel of truth. But I want to address what my real opinions are today. Now let's get to the Armenian Genocide. So, did I write things about that when I was younger? Yes. So that part is true. So I did deny it earlier. I wrote in a column when I was in college about that, and so obviously a long time ago. Well, what's my position? I think I've stated it clearly a number of times, but I'm going to state it one more time here. Okay, the Armenian Genocide happened. It existed. It's true. Okay. I don't know how I could be any clearer than that. So I know that some Turkish folks grew up believing in things that were taught to them, whether it was in Turkey or through other means. And I know because I lived that, right? I'm a Turkish American, and I grew up believing the things that I was taught. Looking back on it, some of it is absolutely absurd. And there's Armenian Genocide is an incredibly serious issue. I'm only saying this in the context of other things that I was taught in Turkey are now, you look back, are comical. So I remember that we were taught when I was in third grade, but apparently we had some history between first and third grade there. And I remember we were taught that the Turks had never lost a war other than World War I, because that one was a little hard to deny. And then later, when I read stuff about how Turks had lost many different wars, I was confused at first, because when you get taught something when you're a kid, it is super hard to break, including religion, right? And so, of course, Turks have lost wars. That's preposterous, right? And I remember we used to chant when I was a kid, Turkey's the biggest, there's no other country that's big. Preposterous, right? So that's the context in which I grew up. And so looking back at some of the stuff I wrote, there is an American colonel who said, for example, the Armenians returned fat and entirely unmassacred. Preposterous. When I read it at the time, I didn't have the context of being an adult like I am now, and that lasted far too long, by the way, my ignorance on the topic. And I couldn't understand what I know now. If I had read that now, I'd go, wait a minute, does he have an ulterior motive? So I don't know about that particular colonel, but I would be really surprised if he wasn't going to try to get a contract with the Turkish government for something or other afterwards. Nobody returned unmassacred, let alone, all the other things that he said. And to my Turkish friends who are deeply offended by all of this, and yes, and if you live in America, you can say, oh, it's their fault and they're terrible, etc. But they're taught a certain thing, and so when they're challenged on this, they say, no, well, it was a civil war, it was and it was just massacres. Really? That's what you're going to say? No one denies that there were massacres. There was definitely terrible massacres. No one denies that the Armenians were driven out. So your big contention is, well, technically I don't want to call that a genocide. First of all, you're factually incorrect. Srebrenica is called a genocide. Only 8,000 people died there. I don't want to minimize that. It's terrible. In that case, it was Muslims that were targeted, but they were targeted because they were Muslim. Far more Armenians died in the Armenian Genocide, and they were targeted because they were Armenians. Whatever excuse you want to make about why, they didn't target Norwegians, they didn't target other people, they targeted Armenians, they were driven out, they're not in Turkey now, and an enormous number died in massacres. It is a textbook definition of a genocide. And so the last thing that the Turks have to stand on is, well, then under that definition, then what happened to the Native Americans in America is a genocide. Yes, so what? Yes, it is. They were driven out, they were massacred. That's also what Christopher Columbus did as a genocide. That doesn't make what happened to the Armenians any better. So please, let's stop the excuses. It is a genocide, and let's acknowledge it and move on.
So I just have one thing to say about the Armenian Genocide. First, for those of you who have been watching the show on a regular basis, you know that we've already addressed this, but I'm glad that we've addressed it again in a clear, concise way. Secondly, I just want to send a message to those who don't care about the Armenian Genocide and have only used it and exploited it as a way to attack us and specifically attack me and spread lies about who we are and what we believe. What you're doing, and I'm talking about right-wingers in America, okay? What you're doing is spreading false rumors and complete character assassination that has led to serious threats against my life and serious threats against my family members' lives. I mean, it has gotten so serious. I live in Los Angeles, and unfortunately, if you don't respond to these false claims, well, then the misinformation gets to the Armenian community. And I live in LA where there's a giant Armenian community, groups of people who think that I deny the genocide, which is one of the most absurd claims I've ever heard. And the threats against our lives, it's just so sick and so unnecessary, all for these cheap political, brownie points or hits or whatever the hell it is that the conservatives in America want. But one thing that I want to make clear is that had the Armenian genocide happened today and my family members were refugees seeking asylum here in the United States, these same conservatives who are pretending to care about the genocide would turn my family members away. They would call them immigrants, they would call them dangerous, and they would turn them around and tell them to go back to where they came from. So let's just be clear about who those people are. And those same conservatives are making excuses for the genocide that's happening in Yemen today. So I wasn't gonna comment much on this, but I think it is important to really focus on who the real terrible people are when it comes to this issue. And those are the ones who are exploiting it for their own political gain.
And Anna's dad is an Armenian from Syria. And so Syrian refugees would be blocked by the right wing at this current state. So let's just be honest about the things that happened and then and hopefully move on.